If war breaks out in the Middle East, military experts tell us that high-tech weapons, which both the U.S. and the Iraqis possess, will push combat to a level of intensity never before experienced by American soldiers. And a senior U.S. Army psychiatrist told us that for every soldier killed, there will be 4 more wounded, and 2 more who will have to be evacuated from the battlefront for psychiatric reasons. Psychiatric casualties, victims of the stress of battle, victims of shell shock.
Every man has his breaking point, and these, in the fulfillment of their duties as soldiers, were forced beyond the limit of human endurance.
John Huston filmed and narrated this U.S. Army documentary during the closing days of World War II. It was withheld from the public for almost 40 years.
This man, suffering from a conversion hysteria, requires immediate treatment. Organically sound, his paralysis is as real as if it were caused by a spinal lesion, but it is purely psychological.
These soldiers are some of the 500,000 psychiatric casualties the U.S. evacuated during World War II. They accounted for 20% of the total casualties in that war, real-life examples of what fear can do to a man.
The sudden noises bother you particularly?
I could just shake a little, but not that bad. I just took off because I seen too much of my buddies gone, and I figured the next one was for me. A man can just stand so much up there, see.
Even today, 1/4 of the soldiers from World War II who are still being treated in VA hospitals are combat stress casualties. Richard Gabriel is a former Army intelligence officer who worked as a consultant at Walter Reed Army Hospital's Department of Combat Psychiatry.
A psychiatric casualty is a soldier who, as a consequence of fear and deprivation of the brain chemicals in the body, cannot perform his job.
Gabriel told us that battle stress takes 2 forms.
One is either total or partial collapse where the soldier must be evacuated. But the more common is what we call silent psychiatric casualties, where the ability to fight declines.
A serious problem for the military, but not a new one.
In every war in this century, the number of psychiatric casualties has exceeded the number of dead by 100%. The bottom line is fear is a terrible crippler on the battlefield, either in terms of ability to continue to fight or the need to evacuate the casualty from the front line.
In the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, almost 1/4 of all the casualties were psychiatric. Military experts say the high intensity, the fierce combat of that conflict was similar to what we could expect should Desert Shield become a shooting war. Dr. Reuven Gal was chief psychologist for the Israeli army during that 1973 war. Now retired, he's director of the Israeli Institute for Military Studies. We asked how many psychiatric casualties the U.S. could expect if war breaks out in the Gulf.
I would say if you are expecting numbers of physical casualties in the area of 25,000 physical killed and more wounded, then I would say that you may expect several thousand of psychiatric casualties proportionally.
It's going to be incredibly more intense than it was in World War II, probably 4 to 5 times as intense as it was.
What do you mean intense?
Well, by that I mean the stress levels on the soldiers will be much more intense, and the killing capacities of modern weapons are much more deadly than they were in World War II. Since 1973, weapons have become almost exponentially more deadly, more accurate. The tactics require more mobility, so psychiatric casualty rates are likely to skyrocket.
And all the experts tell us that the best way to keep those rates from skyrocketing is to have well-trained soldiers who trust their equipment, their commanders, and each other, a cohesive unit. But that very closeness can sometimes cause problems.
The more physical casualties you will have, you may expect more psychiatric casualties. They go together. Just the sight of all these wounded and killed people is a trigger or stimulation for further psychiatric casualties. Usually it will happen when a soldier is in the midst of combat, engaged in fire by the enemy, or usually under artillery bombardment or something like that. A shell falls a few yards away from him. Some of his friends are blown apart, are killed, and so on.
And he loses.
he cracks. He cracks for two main reasons. One of them is because he sees all these horror pictures of his friends just a minute ago alive near him, and now a tortured body. But also, it's the sense of a near miss. It could have been me, just a yard away or just a second away.
Retired Army Colonel David Hackworth was wounded 8 times during the 8 years he served in combat in Korea and Vietnam. What about combat stress casualties among reservists who are being sent over there?
Would be mind-blowing because they're just not prepared for the game. They're not anywhere prepared as well as the regulars. And I can recall in Korea getting reservists, it took 3 to 4 weeks before they were ready.
There apparently is going to be no place to hide if it comes to war in Desert Shield. Therefore, women behind the line are going to be just as vulnerable as men.
Well, 17% of the forces in the desert are women, and they're the supporters. They're going to be hit by long-range artillery, by Spud missiles, and more important, they'll be struck by terrorist attacks. And so it's going to have an incredible effect for men to see women with an eye blown out, an arm blown off, or filling up a body bag.
Retired Colonel Dr. Frank Jones was psychiatric consultant to the U.S. Army Surgeon General. The threat of gas, chemical weapons, does that make the soldier more susceptible to combat stress?
Absolutely. In some of the training exercises, we had actual psychiatric casualties. You can't last more than an hour in those protective suits, and some, in fact, became claustrophobic and just couldn't stay in.
The U.S. Army says that one of the ways it plans on beating the Soviet-trained Iraqi army is to fight in the dark using a variety of night vision devices.
Our tactics and those of the Soviets require an awful lot of night fighting. So that period of respite that you used to get, either at night or the ability to hunker down in the trench, will come no more. The soldier will be under condition of permanent stress, permanent threat to his body, to his mind for periods of 36, 48 hours at a time. And
many you mean without sleep?
Going to have to do it. I mean, the amount of sleep you get isn't going to be sufficient to replenish the body or the mind.
One question that always comes up when you talk about combat stress is, are the soldiers who break down cowards?
No, it just depends on the individual. You can take these big Rambo guys, 6'3" and tough as nails, and the first shot, and they become whimpering sissies, and the little guy with glasses that you, a Woody Allen type, turns out to be Audie Murphy, which is what Audie Murphy was, 15-year-old boy, 5'2".
So you can't predict ahead of time?
No, not until the slugs start snapping, and that's when you really determine who's good and who's not good.
The first week, you're going to take 50% of your psychiatric casualties in 1 week.
Because?
Okay? The stress levels are incredibly high to people who've never been exposed to that. Then for a period of about 10 to 14 days, you're going to get good fighting capability out of your soldier because he now becomes battle-wise. By the 3rd week, you start to have silent psychiatric casualties set in, and by the 28th day, the United States Army studies in World War II shows that of all the soldiers exposed to combat for 28 days or longer, the rate of psychiatric symptoms requiring evacuation was 98%. The only people who...
Wait, 98% of what?
Of every 100 men exposed to battle for 28 days, 98% suffered psychiatric symptoms that were debilitating enough to require evacuation.
In order to get as many of those psychiatric casualties as possible back into combat, Dr. Gall says you have to treat them fast.
You have to treat him, first of all, as soon as possible, but you also have to do it with the expectancy that he will return to his unit. Put him to sleep. Give him enough water and enough food. Put him to sleep for several hours because that's what he needs first.
Where? Where do you put him to sleep? You say
in the field hospital, right there. In the field hospital. Let the shells be heard in the distance because he has to understand that he is still part of that overall environment. Right. If you evacuate him to a quiet hospital in the rear, there are very little chances that he will get back to his unit.
Dr. Gall says that most combat stress casualties should be able to return to their own units within 72 hours. But Richard Gabriel says if you cannot return a soldier to his own unit, the rate of recovery drops sharply, and the chance of permanent psychiatric damage increases.
In this war in the Gulf, once a soldier is taken off the line, either for minor wounds or for psychiatric, the odds of him being returned to his unit before this war ends are almost zero, in my judgment.
Why?
Can't find the unit. No one, to the best of my knowledge, has worked out a doctrine for reintegrated psychiatric casualties back into their units in a modern, high-speed, highly mobile conventional war.
If we've been told correctly that there are missiles that are capable of penetrating rear areas, then first of all, there won't be a safe rear area for treatment. And in addition, formerly safe areas in the rear are not going to be safe, so that not only our active combat troops, but also the support troops are going to be prone to break down as well.
Dr. Gall, what happens if you don't treat stress casualties fast?
You pay a high price in the long run. Treating them on the spot is not for the sake of the military, it's for their own sake. But you also pay a high price from the point of view of the society. The society will never forgive you if you treat only the physical casualties and you ignore the ones who have paid for that horror of battle by their mental capacities.
U.S. Army psychiatrists told us that the rate of combat stress casualties in Desert Shield could well be twice as high as they were in World War II. In Desert Shield, for every soldier killed, they say, you can reasonably expect 4 wounded physically and 2 more wounded psychiatrically. But when we asked the Army to say that on camera, they refused.
No army or no culture has a vested interest in pointing out to the fact that more men are driven mad historically than in fact have been killed. The bottom line on this is that psychiatric collapse is the reaction of a sane mind to insane circumstances. It's an attempt on the part of a sane person to stay alive when the world goes crazy. So from that perspective, no one wants to talk about psychiatric casualties, although to give the military its due, we try to plan for them as best we can.
Officially, the U.S. Army says they are better prepared now to deal with psychiatric casualties than at any time in the past. But they also say that war is unpredictable, so there is no way to know the whole scenario before it begins.